Aloha and good evening. My name is Jürgen Steinmetz. I'm joining you from Honolulu, Hawaii for Livestream.travel and eTurbo News. We're celebrating the entire month the launch for World Tourism Network. World Tourism Network started way back with the Rebuilding.travel initiative, and I'm saying way back, not so way back, but in March during a non-existing ITB, when we had probably the first people in the world a discussion on COVID, when COVID just became popular. And that has grown into a sizable number of travel professionals and people like yourself. And currently, we're structuring it more into an organizational structure. What is World Tourism Network? We have a little bit more than 1,000 members in 124 countries, and we're growing. The organization is meant to be built from the bottom up and not from the top down. That means our chapters we're putting in place. We have 11 places now in the world. These could be cities, countries, regions, should really take the lead in the organization together with our interest groups. And interest groups, you can see it, we have a number of them. One is Green and Clean, what is run by Professor Geoffrey Lipman, who is also the moderator in today's session. He's joining us from Brussels, Belgium. And if you wanted to know more about WTN, so in case you're not a member, you should become a member. We have both free and paid options. You can go to WTN.travel. And we also have a number of other events coming up, really good events. One actually just about an hour after we're finishing with this one about aviation. We have one about tour guides all over the world. And you can see our organization is really trying to become a spokesperson for the medium and small businesses. And that's really what we're aiming for. I wanted to welcome everyone who's joining us live. Besides those joining us live, we're live now also on all pages on eTurbo News, on 16 other publications, on a number of social medias. And this will be repeated after the event for a few weeks. And then it's also archived. If you wanted to listen to what we're doing right now, give us about 24 hours and you find it on worldtourismevents.com, or you can just simply go to worldexpo.travel and you also find all the other sessions we had over the last few weeks. But without further delay, I'd like to go to Brussels to my good friend, Geoffrey Lipman. Welcome, Geoffrey. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Thomas. Good morning to you, or good evening to you, as I guess it is in, good afternoon, is it, in Hawaii?
Yeah, it's about 7 in the evening, so. I just figured out we're actually a neighbor with our other guest, Susanne Becken, who's joining us from New Zealand. We only have 1 hour time difference, but in reality, it's 23 hours because she's a day ahead of us.
Okay. Well, as you've been kind enough to introduce me, perhaps I can take over now, introduce myself a little bit more. I'm Geoff Lipman. I'm the former Assistant Secretary General of the UN World Tourism Organization, the first President of the World Travel and Tourism Council. And before that, for 20 years, I was working with IATA, where I eventually was the Executive Director. Nowadays, I'm the president of an organization called SunX Malta, and that stands for the Strong Universal Network. And the X is because our focus is on climate change. Climate is existential. And our link with Malta is that they're our host and partner for this activity. Malta is a small EU island state which has always had a strong interest in the climate agenda and was the first country to actually put climate change on the agenda of the United Nations General Assembly. And a quick word about Sun. It's a legacy to Maurice Strong Universal Network, and it stands behind the thoughts and the vision of an individual who for 50 years had a greater influence on the development of the global sustainable development and climate action agenda than any other human being. He was the first chair of the Earth Summit in 1972. He organized that. He then became the Secretary General of the United Nations Environment Programme. He set that up. He was the man who was the Secretary General of the Big Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And from that, he was the architect of Agenda 21, of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He had a hand in the creation of the IPCC, the Science Committee, which provides all of the data analysis for the UNFCCC action. And he died on the night of a week before the Paris Climate Summit in 2015. And that summit began with a eulogy to Morris from the then Deputy Secretary General of the UN, Achim Steiner. And Achim said no individual has had a greater hand on developing a global strategy for sustainability and climate action. So I'm delighted that we have a small public-private organization established in the EU and based in Malta, and its goal is to carry on this 50-year action of Maurice Strong to alert the world to the challenges of climate change, and more importantly, not just to alert people, but Maurice set in place all the institutions which we now take for granted, within which the international community has crafted its own response to the climate crisis. And that's why I'm so delighted today to have with me, for the first in what I'm calling our Fireside Chat series, where we will explore climate-friendly travel, the theory and the practice, what it means. And I'm delighted to have today my friend and colleague, Dr. Susanne Becken, professor from Griffith University on the Gold Coast in Australia, an advisor to the government of New Zealand, a science advisor to the government of New Zealand, a member of the advisory board of Air New Zealand, and the Ulysses Award winner, which is the highest academic honor that the UN World Tourism Organization bestows in the academic community. So we're going to have a wide-ranging discussion today, Susanne and I, mostly Susanne, and I'm going to be listening and interacting with her. Susanne, welcome.
Hi, Geoffrey, and hello, everyone around the world. One of the good things out of COVID is that we have become so much more accustomed to get together online. Something that we could have done before, but we just didn't, and now we do it and it becomes normal and it's fantastic. We probably cover most of the time zones, I'd say, on the screen. So really good to be here.
And we have the technology now, Susanne. Historically, not only did we not have it so accessibly, but certainly my generation, less so yours, my generation didn't know how to use it. So we've all become familiarized with the world of Zoom and Teams, and it will have an impact, I'm sure, on travel, don't you think?
I think so. In fact, I did a recent piece of research with my government colleagues to find out whether government officials will travel more or less in the future. And that was quite clear that people really quite like, I mean, of course, everyone likes to travel also for business, but less is more, I guess, and using online tools definitely sort of now it's it's become a bit a new norm. Quite interesting, also more socially acceptable. Beforehand, people felt, you know, if you don't go somewhere in person, it might be a expression of lack of interest or commitment, you know. If I say, oh, no, I don't want to come. Whereas now it's you know, it's totally okay to get together online, and that's really great. I do think it will have quite some implications on the business travel component.
And looking at yourself, I mean, we've seen each other in the recent decade in I can certainly think in London, but we first met in Bali in 2007. We'd actually interacted before because you were part of a team in 2007 actually, but working earlier than that with Daniel Scott and other more science-minded academics. I think you were part of that team that did the first analysis of the impact of climate change for tourism. Would you like to tell us a bit about yourself, first of all, Susanne? You know, how did a young German girl end up in New Zealand as an advisor to the New Zealand government?
You've given my age away by telling how long we've been interacting. That's about 20.
Is it because New Zealand has such a dynamic young lady prime minister that you can so easily fit in?
Well, she is really young and she's fantastic. But yeah, I mean, New Zealand, I came here for my PhD and sort of really moving from ecology into tourism. And I must say that New Zealand is one of those countries in the world where this whole idea of I mean, back then we talked about ecotourism actually. I mean, things go in phases and fashions, but so ecotourism became sustainable tourism, and now it's sort of regenerative tourism. Anyway, we might come to that later, and sometimes it's the same thing. Sometimes the concepts actually broaden, but it's really a great place to look at how tourism and the environment interact, and hopefully in some ways how tourism can do something good for the environment. One problem of New Zealand, of course, is we're so far away. And we do feel it now, by the way. I mean, we're doing well on the COVID front, but we're rather isolated. Even Jürgen in Hawaii, you called me your neighbor earlier. I do think we need to fly probably 6 or 7 hours to see each other. So this is the problem here of the carbon footprint, but it's a great place to live and work. And I do think, I think, Geoffrey, we meet each other once a year in person, just about at one or the other event. But now in the last 3 months, we've probably met more often virtually for various interactions. So that's great.
Absolutely. In fact, the last time was, I think it was the last time, was the event that you organized in China. If you remember, you had a very good event. You brought a lot of the more thoughtful people, practitioners as well as academics, together in China. Why did you do that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the Chinese government was and still is, but I mean, there's always so many things happening in China, but they are very committed to addressing climate change and carbon emissions, but also, by the way, the impact of climate on tourism. And most of you who are listening obviously know a lot about tourism. That's why you're here, and you can imagine the size of the Chinese tourism market alone. I mean, domestically, I mean, we think about outbound Chinese, and that's a lot, 100 million a year or so, but internally there's 4 billion people traveling. And so the Chinese government has a strong interest in making sure, well, it's low carbon. That's where the whole high-speed rail network fits in, but also they are getting a little bit concerned about the heating, in particular in the big cities. And you will remember Shanghai, when we talked in China, Geoffrey, Shanghai, all these places that get quite some solid heat waves. And you've got millions of people who then want to escape into what the Chinese call summer tourism mountain resorts. And so this is like a big master plan for, in some ways, climate friendly and climate safe travel, right? And so they throw a lot of resources and thinking on that.
I'm a big fan of China. I was there first time in 1980, before you were born, Susanne. And I went with the Director General of IATA. I was then the Chief of Staff, and the two of us went to China to discuss with the head of the China Airline, CAAC, about it moving into the international arena. It was at that time one of the biggest airlines in the world, because it not only did the carriage of people, it had all of the cargo movement in China, and it did the agriculture, you know, it did crop dusting. And when I went there in 1980, the airport was sort of huts. There was no road from the airport to Beijing like you have nowadays, superhighway. There was just an ordinary sort of 2-lane road. There were no cars in Beijing. There were just millions of people on bicycles in blue and green Mao suits. And we had meetings with the chairman of CAAC, who was in fact a minister. And I learned at that stage two things that you mentioned. One, the immense size. Someone told me you should never say China, you should say China 1 billion, because that's how many mouths they have to feed every year if they want to keep their society together. And that explains a little bit about the nature of Chinese society. And then this is your lecture, your discussion, but it's interesting. I went back again in 1995. I went many times from 1980 to 1995. In 1995, the Chinese government invited the World Travel and Tourism Council, which I was then the president, to bring in 15 chairmen and CEOs of the big travel and tourism companies to work with the CNTA, the China National Tourism Administration, and all their senior people, the chair, the vice chair, all their department heads, as they started to plan the opening of Chinese tourism. There was no tourism at that stage. And they had 12 selected areas where they said, we are going to have tourism here and people will be able to move. Otherwise, they couldn't move. It wasn't permitted in the society. And you know, China gets a lot of criticism. We sat for 3 times we sat for a week at a time with the entire top management, ultimately some members of the State Council even, and they planned the 5 and 10 and 15-year rollout of domestic tourism across China. And the country is incredible, the size and when it commits, and you know, we'll talk about this, Susanne, but its recent commitment to be carbon neutral by 2060, President Xi at the United Nations, it's a huge plus for the world, don't you think?
Oh yeah, I mean, look, China is an interesting country and interesting new form of you know, governance, if you want. But I mean, certainly if they set their mind to do something, I feel there's probably a higher chance of them achieving it. The 2060 goal, I think, might have given a bit more impetus again to other countries, because it sort of demonstrates, of course, what China does will matter the most, well, in America, really, the 2 big emitters, but most other countries, in fact, I don't know if you saw that emission gap report from United Nations Environment Program. Yes. Yeah, so that for anyone who hasn't seen it, I recommend having a look at. It's an annual publication that looks at the latest data of where we should be in terms of our carbon reduction and where we actually are at. And it's quite a disturbing read. It takes a lot to disturb me these days, I must add, because the bad news are coming fast and furious. But when I saw that we're still on track to warming of 3.5 degrees by the end of the century, 3.5 degrees. And for anyone who's ever looked at some of the impact modeling, that's in fact, it even states that some parts of the planet might become uninhabitable. So that's really, I mean, 3.5 is very serious. And it said that the current 126 countries have now pledged zero net zero carbon by 2050, but hardly any have a plan in place. I mean, including New Zealand, where I'm based. Great ambition, very little plan. And if you really look at the figures, we would need to triple the efforts if we want to stay within 2 degrees and increase them 5-fold if we want to be under the 1.5 degrees. So, so coming back to China, they might be able to do it.
I'm going to get you to unpack this, Susanne, because this is what this whole series is about, I hope, which is about getting people to think seriously about climate change and what its impacts could be. And I particularly wanted you for this first series, not just because I'm an admirer of your discipline as a climate scientist and a friend as a person, but also because you have a beautiful young daughter. And when you make these statements and talk about the long-term future, you have this in the back of your mind that we have a responsibility. Everybody says this since the Brundtland Commission to the next generation, but you feel it personally.
Well, that's right. And I haven't even dared to add up those numbers in my head because my daughter is 12. And if I say end of the century, 3.5 and uninhabitable, that comes pretty close. If she enjoys a good age of 90 or something, it's getting there. But more recently, I have really been lucky to be involved with some of the indigenous people in New Zealand. And so I have to put in a little plug here because they keep reminding me that we're only one species amongst many.
When you say the indigenous people, you mean these sort of 6'6" rugby football forwards who pound the rest of the world into submission.
Exactly those. Exactly those.
From the Brazilian Indians.
But they're very, very smart and very wise, and of course they have also. I mean, the society here is merging sort of different worldviews and cultures, which is really great. But they bring a lot of wisdom and connectedness, and someone in particular I work with keeps reminding me, Susanna, this is not just about our future generations, this is about all the species. This is why I have to say this now. I'm worried about my daughter, but I'm also increasingly actually realizing this is, we have a responsibility, and uninhabitable means, I mean, you can see the news from whether it's from the Antarctic or rainforest. I mean, it's just not good. So we do need to do better.
Well, we had a lecture. You were kind enough to lecture on the diploma course that we've set up in SunX Malta, and with those, we have these 45 wonderful students from 30 countries. We have a WeChat, not a WeChat, a WhatsApp room now, and I'm in there learning with them all the time. And yesterday we had a lecture. I don't know if you know him, but he's a good friend of mine, Ignace Shops. And Ignace is a Goldman Award winner. He's the director of the National Park in Belgium, and he's also the president of the Europark Foundation. But personally, he is a nature-based climate scientist. He's worked actually in the park, in the field, and he gave a quite brilliant lecture. And the students loved it, but it was frightening because he talked exactly, but in more detail, about our reliance on nature for our food, for our water, for the air we breathe, and for our sharing it with all the other species. And at the end, he had a slide that showed ego, with man at the top of the pile, and then next to it was eco, and it had all of the species with man as one of them. And I think the point you're making is we are absolutely interacting with them. I'll ask you about New Zealand as we get further into this discussion, because I've been several times. Last time with Achim Steiner. We were on a trip, and it might have been 2009, just before the Copenhagen meeting. Helen Clark was the Prime Minister. We had a meeting with Helen Clark, and New Zealand is a special place on the planet. It's almost as if it was in a time warp, probably because of the distance. But it has this wonderful linkage with the indigenous people. They're part of society in ways that other people are only just coming to accept. And the scenery is incredible, and they're quite useful rugby players.
Well, but we actually have one of the most successful marketing campaigns ever, and it actually has become a little bit of a, an own goal if you really want. But it suits me because you can remind people it's 100% pure, and it's been on various international talk shows. In fact, I remember John Key, who was Prime Minister after Helen Clark. He was grilled by one of the American, maybe Saturday Night or something, about 100% bullshit. Because we do have polluted rivers and we do have issues. And it was about 20 years. It's also, I think, one of the longest standing sort of brains in tourism in the world. And someone came up with this brilliant idea. And now we have to make sure it doesn't lose its credibility. And anyway, there's a lot.
You actually, New Zealand did have a clean and green campaign. I think I stole this.
Yes.
For this series from that old campaign, and that was designed to introduce kiwis, the kiwi fruit, to the world, if you remember. So
and that might have morphed into the 100% pure, because we still use clean and green, and but yeah, it's
no, it morphed.
Right. Okay.
Coincidentally, there was a guy called Lorne Clark who worked with me at the beginning of WTTC. He then moved to IATA, became the general counsel of IATA, who's a Canadian guy. And it was his wife who organized the Kiwi campaign. That's how I know, about it. But look, let me take you back. Take us to the beginning. In your words, in simple terms, tell us about climate change and why it's existential and why that's such an important issue. Just around, not deep science, but enough science that people who look at this can understand why it's a challenge, and particularly a challenge for tourism. We can talk about that afterwards.
Gosh, I wasn't prepared for an elevator pitch to explain climate change, but I guess maybe with a slightly personal touch, because I've been sort of involved in this research for, say, over 20 years, and it's quite interesting how back then, so say around 2000 or late 90s, it was almost something, and you will remember that in some of you who were listening, we talked about always the end of the century, and there were the models for 2100, and it was sort of almost a bit like a scientific curiosity to do these models and find out that it's going to get warmer, but it was rather abstract back then, and kind of important but abstract, and I think it's been really moving in the climate science community has been moving from this kind of almost matter of fact object of scientific inquiry to something quite deeply emotional, concerning, that people feel all of a sudden. So it's even blurred the boundaries between scientific reporting and advocacy. And it actually has put a few scientists in, so because as a scientist, you're always meant to be neutral. You're not meant to walk in the street and shout, this is urgent. But climate change has shifted this.
You might remember Michael Mann.
Yes, of course.
The American professor. We had him speak at an event we did in New York 18 months ago during Climate Action Week. And we had the first Maurice Strong event. And Michael Mann came to speak to us. And Michael Mann was the man who produced the famous hockey stick curve. And I think it was that hockey stick curve which had the greatest impact, that showed that, like the handle of the hockey stick for millions of years, the carbon blanket around the world had kind of sort of muddled along. And then since man began with his industrial activity, the sharp rise, and that became the hockey stick, and the hockey stick became the manifestation, no pun intended, the manifestation of the translation of science into something that ordinary people could understand. It was just zooming up after millions of years of being static.
Well, that's right. And then I think what is important is that people obviously, so if you think of the time compressing from what we thought might happen in 100 years, really people being confronted now and understanding that, I mean, I just take you back to the bushfires in Australia 1 year ago. The magnitude of those fires, the extent of never previously experienced, the wind speeds, the temperatures, because what the carbon or the greenhouse gases more broadly do is that they trap so much more heat in the atmosphere, and that kind of accelerates everything and makes it stronger, whether that's the cyclones that we see in although I think you don't call them cyclones in the Caribbean, you call them hurricanes, but because there's so much more energy, there's so much more warmth.
The water is heating up and it's more volatile.
That's right.
And it's not hard to imagine a blanket around the earth of these carbon gases which hold in the heat, and that in turn heats up the land, makes the droughts worse, has its impact on food, and then most visibly in the forest fires, as you had the bushfires in Australia, the fires, and then even the tundra in the Alps, this ice, mushy mud ice, is actually burning. And
that's right. And these are things that people haven't even modeled before, because we didn't quite think that would happen. Like, you think of some obvious stuff. I mean, forest fires in Australia are pretty obvious, but not to that extent. But then there's things happening where all of a sudden, this is this whole notion of runaway climate change, that all of a sudden you get these feedback loops, where all of a sudden, for example, the permafrost is melting. It's starting to melt now when the climate model said it would start melting in 2090. And that releases methane, which then, adds to this whole cycle of making everything more volatile.
Dramatically more impactful than carbon.
Yeah.
And just, sort of local note, our mutual friend, Steve Noakes, he had his lodge, Pinabona. He had a very beautiful lodge. It burnt to the ground in the forest fires. And that brings it home to you that this has a big impact on, and to bring it to the travel and tourism sector, for 100 years, our product, whether it's a skiing product or a beach product, has been dependent on predictable weather. That's probably been the biggest norm. People in Northern Europe go to the Mediterranean at a certain time because it was predictably the sun is there. Well, that's changing, and it's going to change even more, isn't it?
I think that's a really good point. In fact, I think there's three things. The predictable weather, that's really important. And, your classic spa destination and all of it, that's geared around it. The natural asset, and here I'm, for example, thinking about the Great Barrier Reef and other reefs, because under those scenarios that I mentioned earlier with 3 degrees, there's no coral reefs left. And so that has huge implications. And then the third one is the risk, and just coming back to the fire, which in New Zealand, we don't normally have much fire, but now we're actually working for the government agency that's responsible for 1/3 of the land, the Department of Conservation. We're actually now having to look at fire risk to the visitors who are out there, recreating, walking, hiking in huts. And all of a sudden, we've already had a few fires this year in winter and spring, unheard of. And now we start to think, oh, maybe we need to learn something from the Aussies. Let's get a bit seriously, because life's at risk. So I think there's a lot of change for tourism.
That's really serious if New Zealanders begin to think they can learn something from Australia.
We're pretty desperate, eh?
Yes. So we have this situation that most of us understand is going to change lives for our children, and is already changing life for us. Just the very the holiday experience, it's changing for our generation. For our kids, it's going to be really different. I'll give you an example. you remember Francesco Frangeli, who was the Secretary General of UNWTO. He was also the mayor of a small village in the French Alps, Orzine, and back in 1990, their snow started to disappear. They had to spend more and more money on artificial snow machines. And because Frangeli was an academic and a thinker, as the mayor, he actually put into their village an Olympic ice skating rink, because he said that there's going to be a stage in the future when we won't be a ski village anymore, but we're a mountain village, and our livelihood depends on getting tourists. So he very cleverly organized an Olympic ice skating rink in a village which previously would never have thought of this sort of thing. And that's the kind of change that I think we're going to sort of be foreseeing.
Well, that's good. That's very forward thinking, and I think that's what we need to do better in tourism, forward thinking. And then, of course, the next thing that I have to say here is that adaptation. So that's adaptation that you're talking about has to be low carbon, and that's, you know, when we talk about climate friendly travel, we must take the carbon out of travel fast, and anything that and this is the chance now with the, you know, redesign of tourism after COVID, and also the trap that we fall back into our patterns. But we do have a chance to think where can we sort of rebuild without the carbon.
And carbon is from your perspective the most significant issue at this moment. Why is carbon so important, given that these other gases, the methane, the sulfur oxide, the nitrous oxide, are actually more potent in terms of the greenhouse effect? Why is it that carbon is the unit of measurement? Now,
so
scientists.
Yes, yeah. So carbon is, I guess, the most abundant sort of molecule, if you want, in any fossil fuel. And it is a bit less potent than, say, methane or so, but it lives much longer. So when you every time you blow carbon into the atmosphere, it stays there for thousands of years. I mean, some will get reabsorbed into the ocean, but we're talking historic timeframes, not our little 100 years that we're now really concerned about. So whereas the methane only lives for 21 years, something like that. So it's potent, but it then disintegrates. So it's really the CO2 that's of concern, and that's just the main part of fuels. But there are, I mean, when you talk aviation, for example, there's other effects, like, in fact, quite interesting up here. Where is it? Whoever put this lovely picture together, you can see some contrails. So those contrails in cirrus clouds induced by aviation, they do actually contribute quite a bit. The good news would be that if we make that move towards synthetic fuels, we will reduce that. And please don't ask me about the science in detail. I refer to a very competent professor at Manchester University, David Lee. He is the authority on the atmospheric impact of aviation. So he could explain this, but one reason why we have those cirrus clouds forming is because of the impurities in the fossil fuel. Even though we clean it already, I mean, aviation fuel is quite refined, but there is stuff in there that leads to those clouds in synthetic fuel. So, for example, that we were to produce with CO2 capture from the air and hydrogen using renewable energy.
Talk about this? I know we're going to do another panel today about aviation with our friend Vijay Punsami, but just for this session, let's have just a little side discussion around, first of all, the amount of the tourism sector as a whole puts into the total carbon count. When you did the work with Daniel Scott for UNWTO, and you know, this is a figure that's sort of in my brain, it was pretty much, we used the figure of 5%.
Yeah.
And yet recently there has been studies in Australia, some of your colleagues perhaps, which is measuring it in a slightly different way, I think, and has come up with a figure of 8%, which of course all of the climate activists have leapt upon and sort of destroyed quite a number of years of advocacy from the tourism world of 5%. Tell us a little bit about how do you get 5% and it suddenly becomes 8%? It doesn't seem like a big shift, but that's a pretty big jump.
Well, it is, and so just before I sort of explained, the one bottom line message is that they're both quite big numbers. So tourism is definitely worth talking about. So that's one thing I take from that. But then, so 5%, when we did the 5%, that was 2005 data, whereas this one now was 2014 data. So there would have been some growth. And I mean, one of the exciting things, of course, about tourism has been that it was always growing more than other sectors. This is why it's so important for governments economically, but with that came probably a higher increase in carbon footprint. But that probably won't explain that much. The key is that back then we took quite a narrow focus where we really looked at tourism transport, accommodation, and activities. So if people go on boat rides and whatever people do, go to museums. So we estimated those three sectors, which you might call core sectors of tourism, and that came out at 5%. Now this new study takes quite a different approach that is much more comprehensive, using upstream, downstream, basically everything that a tourist would have consumed during their trip. So from the food to the plastic.
So it's more like using the satellite accounting system that the UNWTO and more significantly the WTTC has developed. So when WTTC, for example, says we're 10% of the global economy, half of that is the direct and half of it is the indirect. That's what you meant by upstream and downstream.
That's right. That's right.
And that's
so
a big,
that's a big difference.
The 5% of GDP, and I know this from my days at WTTC when we developed these numbers, we had the opportunity to just use the 5% or add the indirects, it's called. 5% is the directs, and then there's an equal amount of indirect, and then a third component, the induced, and that's which comes from other activities, from the food that people eat in hotels, and that's kind of thrown in. So you would think that the 8% is a reasonable reflection of what the tourism sector creates in the global economy in the carbon world.
If I take a consumption-based approach where everything is tracked back to the consumer who is a tourist. So this is, if I, for example, let me eat a piece of meat in a nice, now let me not eat a piece of meat because too high carbon. Let me get a nice vegetable risotto. But if I'm consuming it as a tourist in this 8%, the carbon would have counted towards that. But there's other ways for accounting where you might then allocate some of that to agriculture or to other sectors. So it really, I mean, this is why I always say you have to question every statistic. The 8% I would call a very comprehensive estimate of the consumption of tourism. That's the contribution to climate change. If you cut it in a slightly different way, and if you get rid of all the things that you want to allocate to other sectors, you know, even for example, for every liter of fuel that you burn, you can add about 10% that is embodied in the production of this fuel, so extracting it, refining it, transporting it to the petrol station. So really every liter is 1.1 liters. You can say I'm responsible for that, or you say, well, I only take that 1 liter, the 10% is part of the petrol station or the refinery. I'm not you know, so it depends. Just question every statistic. But what's really interesting, I guess, about both those numbers, 5 and 8%, is also how it's composed. So for example, that more recent study, I was really interested to find, I mean, we know that transport and aviation are the big chunks, but the one that came out as a bit of a surprise was food. Really interesting the food that tourists consume and the climate impacts embodied in food. And that tells me, I mean, that is a very great opportunity for tourism to cut the carbon footprint, because there's so much food wastage in hotels and buffets, and that seems to be, in fact, that's a no-brainer, wouldn't it? Because you save costs if you're smarter as a hotel, maybe even airlines, convention organizers. There's a lot of food waste in the choice of foods. That came out as one of the really big ticket items.
Interesting. And just looking at the growth, and then I'd like to move on to Paris and talk about the impacts of Paris. But looking at the growth, this 5 to 8% has a heavy component of transport, a heavy component of aviation. And as we know, aviation claims that it doesn't have options into the long-term future. How big is the aviation component of this, of the 8%, let's say? Let's use 8%. How big is the aviation component of that? And how will that grow as other people find alternatives looking forward 10, 15, 20 years?
So aviation was about 1/5 of the total footprint there. It was closer to 1/2 of when we did the much narrower study, because we only focused on transportation, accommodation, attractions, but say 1/5. That UNEP emission gap report that I mentioned earlier, there's an aviation chapter in there, international aviation and shipping, and that actually brought a really interesting figure. It said if aviation and shipping continue with their current growth path, but everyone else does what they're meant to do, those two sectors will make up between 60 or 220% of emissions by 2050. So of the fair share of what we need to be. So we literally, what it shows.
60% would be as a result of aviation and shipping.
Yes, so if everyone, so it's this sort of curve, if everyone does this, but aviation and shipping keep going up, by 2050, we were in the best case scenario, those two sectors would be 60% of whatever is left. So the other 40 being some other, bit of agriculture, this and that. So it's dramatic. It tells me that something needs to happen for aviation and shipping.
You're on the advisory board of Air New Zealand. I have been quite critical, not of Air New Zealand. On the contrary, Air New Zealand is a very forward-looking carrier in this respect. But so you're familiar with the aviation world. I've been critical of my old friends in IATA, that the ambition that they have set out for aviation for 2050, for one of the most technologically advanced areas of humanity, is what I have described recently as Neanderthal. It's this old story of let's push everything out for as far. And do you agree with this? I am actually going to write to Willie Walsh, the new Director General of IATA. Not that he'll take much notice of me, but I'm going to write to him and say, you have the opportunity to realign the IATA position to be the same as China, as the EU, as almost everybody in the world with the net zero carbon. They have their figure is that we will, by 2050, we will pollute only up to half of what we polluted in 2005. I mean, it's a terrible position.
Well, and that's based on carbon offsets, and that's a problem in itself. But yeah, I mean, I think it's also a matter of risk management that you can, as the aviation industry, I just put that out there, you can put your head in the sand for another 10 years, but there's a point where you won't get away with it, consuming fossil fuels. You got and you mentioned Air New Zealand. I mean, they, just like some of the other progressive airlines, are really aware that you cannot rely on aviation fossil fuel to 2050. I don't think this will be tenable.
Absolutely not. And here you have these two big sectors with technologically advanced, building these incredible machines which keep us up in the air for 18 hours at a time, coming from New Zealand to the United States. And their ambition is so out of date. And the reason for that is because it was crafted in 2005, and they haven't, and they met, and this, I worked there. I knew how we set up our lobbying activities. You do a McKinsey study, you get a worst case scenario, you develop some response to that. You work with the industry around the world to make sure that governments understand that you're a special case, that you're not covered, and I'll come to that next. In the Paris Accord, you're outside it in another, in a separate convention, and you get a kind of community which is less ambitious than the rest of the world, and yet, and then you have who are you working with? The fossil fuel companies, the richest companies, the people who were the original climate deniers, and who get massive subsidies from governments in order to prospect for more pollutants. And they sit with the airlines, and they are very difficult to get an alternative fuel. We don't have enough room. The cut of the barrel is so narrow. The demand is so small. I mean, I see you smiling, but this is
no, I agree. It's in aviation. It's very political.
They then say, and it's going to be 3 times as expensive. Well, fine. If it's 3 times as expensive, put it in the price, and that way the market has some attempt. And of course, it is a big demand, and it's a consistent and growing demand. And here you have these 2 big industries, aviation and fossil fuel, and their ambition is the least ambitious of any human activity.
Well, that's right, and I guess you do it as long as you get away with it. And at some point, if you don't change, you get forced to change. But I mean, one thing that I do have to bring up here is the bailout packages, because it is astonishing that for so many years there was no money to, for example, a synthetic aviation fuel plant might cost in the order of 500 million, $500 million. And of course, I just think 1 year back, any airline and any government would say, well, we don't have $500 million for this. It's not possible. And fossil fuel is cheap. Now, American Airlines alone got 60 billion. European Airlines got 32 billion. Air New Zealand got 1 billion. Only 2 out of 50 countries have attached some form of environmental conditionality. That's Austria and France. None of the others have. So that's kind of getting me, but we think, where was this money beforehand when we have an existential crisis? Anyway, so we've got an aviation panel coming up later. We might talk about it, because it's obviously a huge opportunity now to invest into cleaner aviation.
Well, to answer part of your question, I can tell you, when I was president of WTTC, I had this very high-level group of board members, and they were the chairman and chief executives. And I asked one of them, I won't reveal the name here, but the chairman of an American airline, very big airline in the United States, I said, with all of these returns which you show, particularly with IATA, where there's no money being made, how do you stay in business? And he smiled at me and he said, well, my salary keeps increasing, and we're buying more airport facilities, and we buy more aeroplanes, and of course we don't have any profit, but that's okay. So it's a cruel world. Look, I want to take us into what is perhaps the last part of this session, because we've been going pretty much for an hour now. I wasn't sure that we could keep this going. Let's just talk a bit about Paris, and why Paris was so important for the world community, and this concept of sort of ratcheting up ambitions. And it's very important to me at this moment, because we've produced this registry of industry ambitions, which I consider to be the sort of gateway into planning. You mentioned before, people need to make plans, people need to act. It's not enough to just make nice statements. So let's talk about Paris, where the change very much began. Your impression of Paris?
I mean, I always saw it as a glass half full and half empty, you know, half full because the world community did get together and did agree on what they agreed on, and you know, that we really need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees and so on. Half empty because it was already then clear that the commitments weren't enough. And I mean, it's actually quite amazing how time flies. It's been 5 years since Paris, and emissions have gone up every year. So and countries have not ratcheted up, you know. And the big question now is whether COVID will, you know, I remember in 2007, climate change was a big topic. Back then, you know, there was the Inconvenience Truth movie, and the IPCC got the Nobel Prize and so on, was big. And then the financial
rally together, I think.
That's right. And even for tourism, yeah, it was a big topic. But the financial crisis came, and it was sheer business survival in people's, you know, so it dropped off. And so I do hope that, and in fact, after the financial crisis, the emission intensity more than overshot. It went up more than making up for it. I really hope we don't repeat that. It's all coming down to the stimulus packages and what governments do with the money.
But what Paris did, Susanne, if you know, I can be a little bit of a devil's advocate here, because I'm a big believer that Paris was a changing moment, like the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, because every country agreed to a set of procedures. And in fact, 200 countries, that procedural framework committed every country to file its own long-term 2050 carbon reduction plan with the UN Climate Agency, the UNFCCC, and to commit to revisit that plan periodically and update it. It set in place a global system which was applicable for each country. Each country, and this has always been a big sticking thing in the UN system. How do you get everybody to reach an agreement?
Yeah.
The way you do it is you put it on everybody to set their own standards, and then you aggregate everything inside the UN agency, and you say, yes, if we all do that, it will help us to keep the Earth's temperature down to this mythical 2 degrees Celsius above in pre-industrial levels, or 1.5 degrees, which is now where everything has focused on. So would you agree with me that Paris was a defining moment for the world community?
I would agree with that. So I'm glad you bring me back to a bit more optimism. That's really good. But nevertheless, we can't let it slip. And it was creating that moment, but we need to deliver with the action, and we haven't done that yet.
No, but if you look back to 1972, Maurice Strong. I have a video of Maurice Strong in 1972, just before the Stockholm summit, on BBC, saying the greatest single crisis for mankind is the climate crisis. You know, and when people ask me, are you supporting, you know, the climate issue, I say, hey, we've got an organization which was doing this in 1972. And our inspiration is a guy who put institutions in place. Yeah. So you had Stockholm, and then you had the Brundtland Commission, and then you had Rio, and all these, and then you had the Millennium Development Goals and the sustainable. We haven't even talked about that. That's a whole area of change in the area of sustainable development. And then you had Paris, and with Paris, it wasn't only Paris, as you well know. There was another parallel conference in Addis Ababa in 2015, where they made the pledges to give financial support to the developing countries so they could make the changes that would allow them to actually deliver on their carbon reduction and economic and energy changes over 50 years that would allow us to get to a more hopeful situation. So I wouldn't despair about the inadequacy at this moment of the big declarations. At least we have a system in place where people are making their declarations.
Now that is true, and maybe I might sort of close by sort of referring to Greta Thunberg, and you sent me a really good video clip a few days ago, Geoffrey, on her little 2-minute speech on Instagram, and she concludes by, we are the hub, the people are the hub. So I think what you're saying, and I do agree, we have the institutions and frameworks at the top. For my little work in government, I know that politicians really have the ear on the ground when they see these people march, when they feel that, of course, the voters and the public opinion is supporting change, then they can use those frameworks to actually drive change. Well, I think that's the combination of those two.
Philosophy in SunX Malta, there are basically 2 dimensions which give us hope. The first one is action. You have to create a framework, an action, a system, which allows people over time to plan, to register their plans, to review them, and to improve them. That's the one part, is the action framework. The second part is the youth, the next generation, represented by Greta Thunberg and by those students which you've interacted with on our diploma course. Our vision is that we are going to educate 100,000 of those smart young people in the tourism sector by 2030 to be advocates and catalysts for change, to become the thinkers of the new leadership of tourism. Because I think that's where I have the hope. When I see, and you lecture too, you're a professor, for me, the greatest pleasure comes when you get a group of young people who are more advanced in their thinking than you are and much more committed. And I think, you know, that's the future. That's our solution.
That's a great message to finish, and obviously everyone on this call is part of that as well, because they took the time. Everyone took the time to listen, and everyone can be part of that movement to drive the change and enable it.
Absolutely. Well, look, Susanne, I can see. I'm sure that you. It's getting to that time where you go and watch the Disney Channel with your daughter. Am I right?
Good. Yeah.
So I really want to thank you. You know, it's a real pleasure to interact with you this way. And we should actually do it periodically without necessarily having Thomas and his cameras here. But I'd like, on behalf of everybody listening, to thank you for being such a brilliant first guest on this, what I'm calling fireside chats. As I say, I have my fireside chat sweater on, which matches with your blouse today.
Again, we've done this before. We've matched last time we did something.
That's right.
Funny.
Okay. And I'd like to hand it back to Jürgen. Thomas, thank you very much for being the host for this, Thomas. And I hope you agree this is a kind of new departure in the discussion on climate change and travel and tourism. And I hope it's been an entertaining as well as an informative session, for not just for the people who are listening today, and thank you for being an audience today, but for all those people in the World Tourism Network who are going to be listening to this on the archive, and we will do something similar in SunX as well as an informative session. Thanks not just that.
No, thank you, Geoffrey, and thank you, Susanne. This was quite interesting. And as you said, we have another discussion.
Not just quite interesting, it was very interesting.
It was very interesting. And I see Vijay already, welcome Vijay. you have our next session, and I let you say a little bit what we can expect, because I really think everyone who listened to Geoffrey should also listen to VJ, who's coming up with his panel in about 45 minutes, and Geoffrey will be a part of it again. So there is some consistency. And but I wanted to thank you, Geoffrey, and I wanted to remind everyone that our organization is about interest groups, and Geoffrey is leading the green and clean voice. My apology. And if you go to our website, you go to interest groups, you find it, you find Geoffrey's picture, and feel free to sign up and be part of it. And this would enable you to continue, not only continue this discussion, but be part of this discussion. Mm-hmm. And that's all we are. We are a network, and we're building a network. And this is how you build networks, and in having a conversation on issues that are relevant to you.
And Thomas, before you go, I'm going to do something, and Susanne's not going to forgive me for this, but I'm going to do it anyhow. I hope that when we have these sessions in the future, you might consider also joining in, because I think your perspective on this issue of climate and travel and tourism, and you sent me something recently on regenerative tourism. You have a very unique and very special perspective, and I hope you would consider sort of participating somewhat regularly if we plan these in a more thoughtful way than I usually am doing.
No, I think it's an important issue for all of us in this industry, because it reflects, like COVID, it reflects our industry directly. And we have 19 people on board here right now. I wanted to also recognize H.M. Hakim. He runs our chapter in Bangladesh. Welcome. And Peter Bryan, he's also one of our heroes, same as Geoffrey. He runs Mafia Island in Tanzania. Thanks for tuning in, Peter. And if there's...
That sounds like a great place for Donald Trump's retirement, Mafia Island.
It has very little to do with mafia, but if you listen to some of the presentations, quite fascinating, and Peter has a very unique perspective on the travel and tourism industry, and I think he would also make a really good candidate to join this group. If anyone wanted to add anything to it, we definitely want VJ to give us a few minutes of what we're going to expect in about 50 minutes. So if you haven't signed up for our aviation challenge event, what comes up in 50 minutes, you can still do this. You go to WTN.travel and you click on the blue banner, or you click on WTN Lounge and Expo. It's right in red in the menu bar, and you can sign up for this and many other upcoming events. They're still coming. For instance, we have Louis D'Amour with the second part of his discussion about peace through tourism, where it will go tomorrow morning, our time. That means in the evening. For those in Europe, we have a discussion with Benjamin Carey in the UK about international recovery through local regeneration. Then also tomorrow, or in 2 days, depending where you are, we have Boomer Women Travel, a discussion with ECPC Consulting Group in New York. And on the 17th, we have Inclusive Sustainable Education and Emotional Well-being, what is done by Snezhka Richter from Greenheart Consulting in the UK. We're expecting Apollonia from Portugal, talking about Dark Sky Portugal. We have our good friend Mona Nafa from Hotel Trust in Jordan, giving us a reason why Jordan is the healthiest spot on earth, and she means the Dead Sea. We also have our friends in Nigeria from Kali Africa Media doing their own panel discussion. I'm waiting to see what it will be. We have Bermuda Tourism as a guest on after Christmas on December 26th, Louis D'Amour. And then we're going to say goodbye to COVID on December 30th. As you know, the Spanish flu ended December 30th or 31st of 1920. It's been 100 years, so it's time to say goodbye to COVID and start over again and start a fresh new year and hopefully a better year than we had this time. And we're going to have Marisol Donato from the World Federation of Tourist Guides Association guiding us into this new year. And we're going to have tour guides from all over the world participating. So this will be a really exciting session because we can't wait to say goodbye to COVID. But Vijay, give us a short rundown. What are we going to expect in 50 minutes or 45 minutes?
Thank you, Geoffrey. Actually, it's going to be a 60-minute, very candid discussion on issues affecting aviation. And for today's session, we're going to discuss COVID-19 and climate change. And we're going to have IATA on the panel, Susan, who you've heard just now, and Geoffrey. So that is meant to be a very sort of candid discussion. I will not be the moderator of that panel. I'll be more the devil's advocate in that panel. So it's likely to be a interesting and hopefully very engaging and very truthful discussion. So I invite you to join and ask your friends and colleagues to join. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, and please do. If there's any last words from anyone, I know there have been some discussions on chat, and I really didn't have the chance to go through these discussions, but we will save it. And if there's anything we can respond to later, of course we'll do that. And you find this session, once we're done, give us about 24 hours. It will be on archive, and it would be rotating around for the next 2 weeks. But I
have a last word, Thomas.
You go.
I have a last word.
Please.
I know you did not mean that we can say goodbye to COVID at the end of the year, because, and I know it wasn't really a policy statement, but I think we all have to realize that, and we can talk about this, Vijay, COVID is going to be with us for a lot longer. It doesn't watch the seminars, the virus. It doesn't listen to the talking heads.
No, I meant this, of course, a little bit more symbolic, because that's what we hope. And this is our New Year's wish, a New Year's resolution. Let's give it a year and get rid of it, you know. But there is some good news at the end of the horizon. We have a vaccine, what is now distributed in many parts of the world. So let's see if we find something positive at the end of the year. We don't want to have a depressive New Year's celebration. It's time to live with this new reality and accept the new reality and move forward. And yes, I don't think we're going to get rid of the virus in a way that the virus won't be there anymore. But maybe we can clean up our thoughts a little bit and come up with a different perspective to see it in a way what is just realistic and not depressive. But that's only a hope. So we all have New Year's resolutions, and it's going to be my wish for 2021. You may have a different wish in Belgium. I don't know. But I got enough of this COVID here in Hawaii, and we're doing our best sometimes not to think about it. And that, of course, is also a mistake. You cannot do right 100% no matter what you try. But anyways, guys, I'm going to see you in about 44 minutes. Thank you so much to both of you. It was very nice, and enjoy the rest of your evening, Susanne and Geoffrey. Maybe you can get a few more hours sleep. No, you can't, because you're going to be on the next event. So have a coffee or something.
I can sleep during Vijay's event.
Okay. All right. I'll see you guys. Good night. Good morning.
Thanks again, Thomas, as ever.
Aloha. Bye-bye. And by the way, thanks, Stephen, again for joining us.